Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Anthropology Department lecture series at the University of North Carolina at Wilmington. For those of you who are not familiar with me, I'm Hikmet Kocamaner. I'm an assistant professor of anthropology here at UNC Wilmington. We are very excited to host Dr. EVREN SAVCI, who will talk about her new book on LGBT issues and activism in contemporary Turkey. So welcome, EVREN, first of all.
Thank you so much, Hikmet. Thank you for inviting me and for hosting this great event.
Thanks for accepting our invitation. We are very thrilled to have you here. So let me introduce EVREN first. Dr. SAVCI is an assistant professor of women's and gender and sexuality studies at Yale University. She received her PhD from the University of Southern California. Following her PhD, Dr. SAVCI was a postdoctoral fellow at the Sexualities Project at Northwestern University. SAVCI is a scholar of transnational sexualities, and her work is informed by feminist and queer theory and ethnographic methodology. Her work explores the intersections of language, knowledge, sexual politics, neoliberalism, and religion. And her research and publications have appeared in multiple journals, such as the Journal of Marriage and the Family, Ethnography, Sexualities, Political Power and Social Theory, Theory and Event, and Journal of Feminist Studies in Religion. So today, EVREN will be talking about her book with us, but we are going to try a little bit of a different format. I'm going to call you EVREN. I'm sorry, because I normally call you EVREN.
Yeah, please do, please. And everybody in the audience when you ask questions, EVREN.
Thank you for letting me call you that. So EVREN will be talking about her book today, and we are going to try a different format. EVREN has already done a series of book talks in multiple places. So if you're interested in a more formal kind of paper type, you can always find those on YouTube. She has given talks at Duke University, and she was also at Yale University. Have you talked at other places as well, EVREN, about your book?
Yes, I have done an event at Smith and another one. I have not been doing a very good job. I'm doing one at Wesleyan on Wednesday. There's one at Santa Cruz that's coming up. But yeah, I've done a few, and they've been at University of Tennessee, Knoxville. So there have been a few.
So those of you interested in a more formal book talk can watch those online. So what we are going to do today is a different format. To keep it a little more dynamic, we are going to still talk about EVREN's book, but it will be in a question and answer format. After doing that, in the second part of this event, EVREN will read an excerpt from her book. So you get a taste of her book from that excerpt. And after that, we are going to turn to what's happening in Turkey today with the protests that are happening at Boğaziçi University, the Bosphorus University, which is Turkey's highest ranking university. And we are going to talk about the increasing anti-LGBT crackdown that the government has undertaken lately. So we want to keep that conversation a little more dynamic. So if anybody in the audience would like to take the floor and ask a question, please raise your hand and I'll try to give you permission to talk. I'm going to try it for the first time. I've never done this webinar format. So if it doesn't work, I apologize, but I'll do my best to give you permission to speak. You can also use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. There should be a Q&A section. You see speech bubbles. So you can always ask questions in written format as well, especially if your question is something that has immediate relevance. I'm going to give you the floor immediately. If not, we are going to have this question and answer at the end. Our goal is to finish this all in 1 hour, but maybe it's not going to be possible. If it's not possible, EVREN has graciously agreed to stay a little longer for your questions. So yeah, you are always welcome to stay longer and ask questions at the end. So welcome, EVREN. It's great to have you.
It's great to be here. Thank you, Hikmet.
So let's start talking about your book first. So let's start with a broad picture, right? Broadly speaking, and in lay terms, because we have audiences from different parts of the world and coming from different disciplines. We even have non-academics, as well as undergraduate students.
Mhm.
So to that kind of a diverse audience, if you had to summarize what your book is about in a couple of minutes, how would you describe your book?
So I would say that, because there are multiple answers depending on the audience that I give to this question, but I would say that most broadly, in my book, I trace the travel of sexual political terminology to the contemporary context of Turkey. Terms like sexual orientation, gender identity, homophobia, outness, hate crimes, those kinds of terms. And I look at the debates and discussions and what I call social disjunctures that are created by them. And I pay special attention to how sexual politics and sexual political resistance to a particular form of governmentality illuminates both the structure and the limits of what I call neoliberal Islam. And I join other scholars of Turkey in that that's not my term, though I think that I might be the first person to use it in a book title like this, but there have been many other scholars before me who have talked about neoliberal Islam or the marriage of neoliberalism and Islam, who I hope all of whom I cite in the book. I tried my best.
Thank you so much for this succinct description. It's always difficult to encapsulate everything so shortly, but you've done a great job. Let's talk about your research a little bit. This book is partly based on ethnographic research you've done in Turkey. So could you give a broad overview of what your ethnographic research entailed? What kind of groups did you talk to? What kind of participant observation you did?
Yeah, thank you, Hikmet. And I kind of thought that I should answer this question in a way that's maybe most useful for graduate students or people who are transitioning from dissertation to a book. But I mean, I will also give a direct answer, but that's kind of my priority in answering this. And I wanted to do that because, research doesn't go the way you expect. And I think that's one of the best things about research. It's a little scary, but it's also, I think it's one of the beauties. If if your investment is not to have a paradigm you're wedded to affirmed, but to actually discover things about the social world. So I was in the latter group. So when I first started research as part of my dissertation project, I thought that I just wanted to see what what LGBT politics looked like in Turkey. And when I started research, it was the summer of 2008, and it was a quite different time than it is now in a number of ways. Maybe not all the ways, but in a number of ways. I talk about that in the introduction of the book. There were all these democratic openings AKP government was involved in, and they were trying very hard to fulfill the Copenhagen criteria for the European Union accession process. There were a lot of kind of laws that were passed or changed, or misogynistic language dropped from the laws. There was the banning of capital punishment. So like all these things were happening. So I thought, I want to see what LGBT organizing and activism looks like. Obviously, as I kept tracing, so the research phase for my dissertation ended around like kind of it was 2008 to 2010. And unlike anthropologists, sociologists don't do as long of a field work. So my field work wasn't, 2 or 3 full years, but I had an initial 9 months and I kept going back for 3 months additionally. And by the time I was finishing up the writing of the dissertation, which was spring of 2011, it was a strange time because AKP's authoritarian face was rising, but that was not being talked about at all internationally. In fact, it was the time of Arab Spring, and most international, especially like European and US media, was talking about Turkey as a model for the Arab world. Like it was referred to as the Turkish model, which I'm sure you also very well remember. So the initial ethnographic work was me looking at and trying to locate politics in LGBT. So I initially went to activist groups because I thought where is a better place to start to look at sexual politics or queer politics. But I also discovered these other sites or other stories that came up during the field work, such as the murder of Ahmet Yıldız, that I wanted to trace, that led me to other queer groups that were not necessarily thinking of themselves as activists or as politically engaged. There is a kind of story of a queer, mostly kind of, it called itself women only, but I would say sort of assigned female at birth people's kind of bar that was seen as a deeply apolitical space. So I did some research with them because I wanted to see what apoliticalness looked like. What does it mean to be political, and what does it mean to fail being a political subject? So I ended up branching out a lot, and I think that was made possible because I wasn't wedded to just studying activists. I wanted to find different sides of political engagement. And as I was transitioning from the dissertation to turning it into a book, like making it a book, the authoritarian politics of AKP got increasingly kind of impossible to overlook, also internationally. And then Gezi Park uprisings happened, and so I found these like exciting spaces to expand the research into that to me told a lot to. And so one other thing is I don't think that in the dissertation I used the word neoliberalism once. I mean, maybe once, I don't remember. So that was not a framework that was kind of important, potent, or as pronounced at the time when I was writing, or I didn't think it was that useful to me. So as I was also doing more research and following up on things over the years, neoliberal Islam became the name of what I back then called power, in the dissertation in a kind of clunky way. Like I was like, I want to see how power operates, or governmental power operates in Turkey. But so that took shape over time as I kept going back into the field. So I feel very fortunate to have had a long time to work on this book, because if I tried to make it like, into a book right after the dissertation in a year, it would have looked nothing like this. And I am happy with what it looks like now.
Mhm. Thank you so much for talking so candidly and openly about this. And it's kind of a masterclass for early career scholars and graduate students, right? Because when you go start your field work, you might have a certain clear path in mind in terms of how many people you're going to interview and what you're going to do your research about. But of course, things on the ground change constantly, right? So you started your research at a time of supposed liberalization under EU reforms, and then that turned into authoritarianism. Obviously, you had to change that. And the frameworks you use, right, back in your dissertation versus the book also changes because everything changes. And I'm in that process, so I definitely relate to you, right? Because like when I did my dissertation, Turkey was different and now it's completely different. I
Yeah,
can't
I mean,
necessarily write the same thing as the book,
exactly.
right? Yeah.
Exactly. And that's kind of the blessing and the curse, I have to say. Like when you try to write about, and that's I think something sociology and anthropology have in common. Not to say other fields don't, but I think maybe more pronouncedly as fields, just because you're trying to write about a really dynamic social field that changes as you write about it. It's a little crazy, but you can't, publish it the way journalism does. And then it's okay a week later if you write something else. So it's yeah, it does take time to digest and to kind of position yourself. But I understand that you relate. I thought that maybe there are people in the audience that might be in a similar place too.
Yeah, thank you for that. So that kind of segues to my next question. You talked about the changes Turkey was going through, and your book kind of sets off to address a series of paradoxes concerning Turkish politics in general, but also queer politics in particular in the new millennium. So during the early 2000s, as you just mentioned, a so-called moderate Islamist or a conservative Muslim party came to power. Yet during this time, Turkey also experienced the rise of a robust and dynamic LGBT movement across the country. I think the Pride March officially started the year before AKP came to power. And when AKP was in power, actually, the Pride March grew significantly. And even in their election campaign brochures, right, the conservative Justice and Development Party, we will call this party as AKP from now on, or AKP with its Turkish acronyms. Even in their election campaign brochures, the conservative AKP government advertised these pride marches as a symbol of their supposed tolerance toward minorities. And then in your introduction, you fast forward to 2015, which is around like 13 years after the AKP's rise to power. And now we see the police attacking people gathering for the LGBT Pride March using tear gas and water cannons. And that became kind of regular after that point on. And very recently, as we just mentioned, the police detained LGBT protesters at the Boğaziçi University campus, and the Turkish government's crackdown on LGBT activists still continue. So in your book, you ask, and I'm quoting, how does one make sense of these stark shifts from exciting democratization to the authoritarian crushing of any and all dissent, all within less than a decade? So what kind of answers does your book provide for this compelling question?
Thank you so much, Hikmet. And I think that I took a quick peek at the Q&A box, like, because I saw there are two questions, and I think this also answers Michael Seidman's first question. I guess the second one is more like a comment, so maybe it's like two question, well, one answer to two questions. So I align my work with scholars of neoliberalism who do understand neoliberalism, or I guess like late liberalism, or late stage liberalism, whatever we want to call it, with already with increasing authoritarianism. So they don't think that liberalism is all about individual freedoms and liberties, and therefore authoritarianism is a stark break from it. Though, of course, we're seeing interesting shifts in, for instance, like, from open borders, we went to Brexit, and the wall between US and Mexico that luckily is no longer on the agenda. But so we have seen those shifts. But ultimately, so I say that the reason for these shifts that Hikmet just summarized is due to what I call neoliberalism. And neoliberalism, I understand as an increasing, and I quote this, or I use Indar Palgraiwal's last book, Saving the Security State, for this definition. So she suggests that, like, if neoliberal capitalism, or neoliberalism, is a system that produces increasing precarity for larger groups of people, because it disappears the middle class, it kind of disappears social safety nets for people, including unemployment and free healthcare and free education or disability, like those kinds of social safety nets disappear, or are really shrinking. There's a rising dispossession and rising debt. Actually, there's a system that wants people and needs people to get into debt increasingly. There's a rise of surplus existence. There's a crushing of labor unions. So there's an increasing precarity and increasing gap between the wealthy and the poor, a radical gap. And if neoliberalism, again, and this is coming from scholars of neoliberalism who think of it as a cultural project, not just an economic project. Also economic changes, like changes in economic policies, but also cultural changes, because the justification of such inequality is shored up by moralizing mechanisms. So through the production of the categories of deserving versus undeserving, the deserving poor, undeserving poor, the rise of respectability politics, increasing individualization of responsibility, right? It's your responsibility to find jobs, it's your responsibility to keep jobs, it's your responsibility to keep healthy, and if you're not healthy, it's your responsibility to pay the bills, to get better. An emphasis on self-sufficiency and self-entrepreneurialism. Again, like, this is seen, I think, increasingly all over the world, like, not to expect jobs from the government, like, and the rise in, everything from YouTube celebrities to these like small entrepreneurs on social media. You should create your own job and be your own boss. Again, this is a moral invitation. It has a moral tinge, this invitation. It's not like, you could have a job with the government, or you could do your own work. One is seen as better because it's more independent, it's more self-sufficient, it's more self-responsible. So I suggest that in the case of Turkey, Islamic morality functions as the key mechanism through which neoliberalism is domesticated, and through which the government designates between the deserving and the undeserving, between the good moral citizens and the bad immoral elements, usually conspiring with foreign powers for the government's downfall, which I'm sure we'll talk about also with the Boğaziçi uprisings. And then between those who need to be securitized and those who will aid with such securitization. So in that sense, because to me, one of the kind of important bits of neoliberalism is its morality politics, I suggest that queers and queer politics especially emerge as a site through which to observe these changes, because they have a much longer history of being on the other side of morality politics of various governments. But the kind of morality politics that emerges with neoliberal Islam is kind of, it's particular to this moment. So it's not the old school homophobia anymore. So for instance, one of the things, if I may give a quick example that I talk about, where like neoliberalism and Islamic morality come together in really strange ways, is the continued, and this has been ongoing for like now so many years, continued positioning of the robust Turkish economy, which is now really a joke, but it's still like positioned as that, as constantly as an object of international envy and constantly under threat by both international lobbies, which Erdogan terms faiz lobisi, the interest lobby, which is like this kind of magical, mythical entity. We don't know who, where, when, but people are conspiring against Turkish economy. And therefore, Turkish economy needs to be saved constantly, needs to be shored up. And then, so the citizens become responsible not just for themselves but also for the nation and the national economy, and the government like connects its own success to the success of the economy, which is another kind of liberal neoliberal tenet, like the what Foucault also calls market veridiction, right? Good economy means good government. Like if the economy is doing well, then the government must be doing well, and vice versa. Like other criteria for good government disappear, such as lack of corruption. If the economy is doing well, like we're good. So I'm interested, for instance, in the book, I look at how in Erdogan's narratives, national loyalty and financial loyalty are evoked in one breath, literally, and are used to shore each other up. And national security is presented as under attack financially. Therefore, any form of dissent, any form of critical, like government, critique of the government, any form of disagreement with the investments or the urban development projects or anything else is discredited morally. But the way the moral discrediting happens is through the evoking of Islam. So these people are not true believers, they're kind of foreign elements, or they conspire with foreigners. This happened a lot during Gezi Park uprisings, which I'm going to read an excerpt about, so I don't want to belabor it now because we're going to hear about it. So I do explain these stark shifts. So authoritarianism is on the rise everywhere in the world because neoliberalism created a further, not that liberalism was terribly sustainable, but neoliberal capitalism is increasingly unsustainable because it really, really creates unsustainable precarity and poverty, and it doesn't want to give. There's, still no proper, I mean, there are some governments that are trying to do some things around it or against it, but clearly many scholars have been saying this is going to create uprisings, this is going to create protests, because people are going to say we don't have enough to eat, we don't have jobs, we don't have healthcare, and then you have to securitize them, right? Either you're going to change the system or you're going to repress dissent. And so the authoritarian shift, it's also happened in the US, happening everywhere, is explained, and we're seeing how protesters are treated in the US as well, depending on the protests, of course. So I do explain the increasing authoritarianism with the increasing kind of precarity created by neoliberalism that is then domesticated through Islamic morality.
Thank you so much for this very detailed response. And it kind of reminded me Wendy Brown's argument about that, right? Eminent political philosopher who's kind of an expert at this point on neoliberalism, right? So she talks about how neoliberalism, even though it has the name liberalism in it, kind of leads to the evisceration of liberal values over time through securitization, through moralizing, and through responsibilizing, citizens. So in the case of Turkey, we see how kind of like Islam provides this kind of moral framework for kind of increasing intervention in the name of security, in the name of national prosperity and things like that. Yeah, very interesting. Thank you so much for this explanation. And I think that addresses the question, right, that Michael Seidman asked, what is neoliberal Islam? Reading the international press, there seems to be very little that's liberal about the Erdogan regime, says Seidman. Yes, that's exactly what I think EVREN talks about in this book, right? Neoliberalism does not necessarily denote liberalism. On the one hand, it does though, right? Under the name of like human rights discourses and things like that, it's promising all this kind of rights to certain minorities, at
And
least nominally, right?
yeah, absolutely. And the individual as the seat of everything, right? The individual rights, individual freedoms, like the collect. I mean, liberalism was not also very fond of collectives and unions or anything like that. But now we're seeing individual responsibility even increasingly kind of becoming the value. So there is a heightening of those things, but there are definitely continuities, and I think that the seat, in the individual, the modern individual subject as the seat of the political project as is one of them, for instance. But I do agree with a lot of Wendy Brown's arguments, like her piece, especially her piece, American Nightmare, is, I think, very useful because she also talks about the kind of the joint project of neoliberals and neoconservatives and the Christian right in the US.
Exactly right. In the US, we have similar overlaps between like right-wing, religiously inspired actors and how they are actually very much neoliberal, right? And also on what you just said, I think it's an important point. So you said individualizing a lot of these issues, right? So would it be wrong to say it is legal and still relatively acceptable to be an LGBT individual, but the moment you ask for rights and you mobilize around those rights as a community and protest and become an activist, then it becomes a security issue kind of thing. I'm really simplifying it, but does
Yeah,
that
no,
make
no,
sense?
you're not though. You're not simplifying it, and it's a great question. I mean, I think that as you know, as you were narrating how the Pride March grew under the AKP regime, I was thinking about this thing that I think it just ended up moving to a footnote. The book is like twice as long actually, but most of it is hidden in the footnotes. There was a moment when I think it was around maybe 2015, was it right before the first attack on the Pride March, there was a group called AK LGBTI artı, so like AK from AKP, so AK LGBTI. And this was, I mean, I don't know, I think this was ultimately one person because there was a Facebook group and then that group became one person. But there was a moment when they were distributing flyers and they were making the argument, look, under what government were you able to march like this and so freely? And under what government has there ever been a pride? Like these kinds of arguments. And they were saying, we are for AKP because it's under this regime that LGBT rights grew. I mean, they were a conservative group, obviously, but it really creates these you know, like as you're asking me, you know, what makes an acceptable LGBTI plus person? Is there such a thing? Makbul, literally, like, what is there an acceptable, even desirable figure? Maybe, you know, like if there was another pro AKP LGBT group, that would be very confusing for the government now because they have turned very against LGBT. Back then, they were more kind of barely lukewarm. But I think that the key is the individual who is content with their job, their family, their whatever paycheck versus people gathering collectively in groups and saying, we don't like this system. We don't want another shopping mall. We don't want another environmentally disastrous bridge. Like literally, and they're not just objecting, so people are who are not just happy to take their rights in the law, like have the law say something nice about gays and then they're okay. The queer movements in Turkey are very multifaceted and very capacious, and that's why I find them very exciting. So I think that the moment there is resistance and there's collective organizing, it's a real problem for this government. Also because it really has predicated its authority on this notion of submission, like right, biat. It's asking it, it's demanding submission from its people openly. And so you really are either for AKP or against it. That kind of polarization also now makes it very difficult for anyone who's critical of the government to be acceptable.
Thank you. Now let's go to another important conceptual framework in your book, which is translation. Even the title is that, right? Queer in translation. So what is being translated here, first of all? So what is your kind of object of analysis there in terms of translation? And also you use it as a theoretical framework as well. So first, if you could talk about like what is being traveled from another part of the world to Turkey, or what is being translated, and also how you conceptualize that.
Thank you. So what is traveling and what is being translated? I argue are these sexual political vocabularies, gender identity, sexual orientation, LGBT rights, um, outness, homophobia, like vocabularies like these that are employed in usually like LGBT organizing or political activism. I don't do the subjectivity terms. I don't look at the travel of gay or lesbian or trans for very particular reasons that I will not get into now because we have a lot more to talk about, but I can talk about it during the Q&A. And I'm interested in translation as a framework because I found myself as I was trying to write about LGBT politics and activism in Turkey. I found myself in this kind of intellectual double bind because a lot of work that was produced at the time. Now there's some more work that I find myself intellectually more aligned with, but the work that was produced at the time very much read LGBT organizing in Muslim majority countries as through the authentic colonial binary, right? Like so. These are not authentic to Turkey or the Arab world or anything else, and any LGBT activism is going to be imposing a particular sexual episteme on to terrains where it doesn't belong. And I didn't read activism like this, and I really wanted a way to talk to. I wanted a way out of the universal particular binary. So I certainly didn't think LGBT activism was the same everywhere. I didn't think it had a universal truth, but I also didn't want to do this like, look at Turkey, how different it is from the US, how different it is from Europe, how different it is from China, because it's not like I don't want to reproduce then the universal center of US and Europe, and I don't want to reproduce these like very reified understandings of cultural difference. It's different and it's not. It's different in unexpected ways. It's not, there's no like, so I didn't want to go to some like pre-modern sexual subjectivity to then say, look, it's authentic to Turkey because we find it even 100 years ago. Like, and I don't believe in those kinds of arguments anyway. So I wanted to find an intellectual framework that was going to allow me to say, this is a limited way to think about it, but not just say it's limited, period, and then my argument is over. So translation in that sense, the translation studies framework, critical translation studies framework, I found very useful because it already disrupts this language equals culture kind of equation. Language equals culture equals difference, right? So if I don't find the word gay in the Turkish language, which is authentic and indigenous to Turkey, it must mean that gay is not authentic and indigenous to Turkey, already has so many assumptions built into it, starting with the fact that Turkish as a language is authentic to Turkey, that it has no history, that there have been no other linguistic erasures of other kind of indigenous like languages or like the reduction to dialect in Turkey. So I wanted to really interrupt this. If Turkish people are calling themselves gay, they're being westernized or they're being inauthentic, because a lot of the words we use today in Turkey, as we know, come from all kinds of languages, and a lot of words have been made to disappear. So translation studies helps me with I guess saying that authentic is a useless framework, like, because for me it is like, so I'm not seeking authenticity or some authentic difference that I can then locate in some queer subjects that don't call themselves gay. So it allowed me to look at what LGBT activists were actually doing without seeing them as reproducing exactly the same thing that's being done in, like, I don't know, Netherlands, for instance, but also without, like, I don't know, fetishizing them as these like radically different people from Western activists. So it helps me think about difference in hopefully more sophisticated ways. And kind of like lets me get out of these, as I said, authentic versus colonial, local versus global, kind of West versus East, or universal versus particular kinds of binaries. I know this is a bit of a like quick summary. I can't say more, but I also know that time is going by very fast. So what do you think?
Yeah, I think this is good enough response for the time being. Of course, I mean, in your book, you have a lot more complicated arguments, right? So those of you in the audience who's interested to go in more depth about it should definitely buy EVREN's excellent book. It's really good. I read it, so I can vouch for it. So EVREN, We are at 5:40 now, so we are
Mhm.
really going over time. I was wondering if you want to read the excerpt now, or should we wait until the end for the excerpt? We can do that too, so that, you know, to keep the conversation going, we can go into the Boğaziçi part, or you can read the excerpt, whichever you like.
I think maybe let's go to the Boğaziçi part because the excerpt is from the book anyway. So we want to share, you know, a taste of the book with you. And the excerpt I was going to read is about the Gezi Park uprisings and my analysis of it, which kind of almost directly in many ways connects to Boğaziçi. But I know we have advertised that we're going to talk about Boğaziçi and people might have to go. So
Yeah.
maybe let's do that first. And even if we skip the excerpt, that's fine with me because it's in the book. Anybody can read it if they want to.
And if
Okay.
we have time, we can always kind of create time at the end, and those who want to stay
Yeah.
and listen to the excerpt can do that.
Sounds good.
There is a question here. Maybe you want to answer that before we move on to Boğaziçi. An anonymous attendee asks, how do or don't discourses or policies of secularism mediate or heighten the paradoxes produced through the domestication of neoliberalism in Turkey?
That's a great question. And it's a grad student, so that's very nice. Thank you for looking forward to reading my book. I would say that, how should I answer this in a succinct way? I think the history of militarized staunch secularism in Turkey has a lot to answer for, I think, about the rise of AKP to power. I don't think it's the only responsible entity, but I think it does. And I think one of the things that I find the most exciting, it's hard to be an optimist during these times, I know, but one of the things that I find exciting and promising is that despite everything that went wrong and that, you know, despite like lives were lost, people are suffering, despite all of that, I think several important breaks happened during this period. And one of them was the secular religious binary. I think it's for, I mean, you have to be a really, really wedded, really staunch and close-minded secularist in Turkey to think all religious people, all pious Muslims support AKP. Because there are so many AKP critics around pious Muslims who are columnists, who are sometimes politicians or other figures. So I think that I feel like I'm giving multiple answers in one, but one, I think that the history of staunch secularism has created, you know, pious Muslim groups as, let's say, as disempowered, through which a victimization rhetoric could be spun by a government that said, you know, you were ignored, you were oppressed, you were not allowed to universities with your headscarves on, we're going to end that, right? And all of those are not untrue. I completely agree that there was a very violent project of secularism in Turkey. Now, I think there is no going back to that. And that, I think, is a good thing because the debates around religion and secularism have become a lot richer in Turkey. I think the other break is around the Kurdish question. There has been a big break in like how the issues are talked about, what's happening politically. Like, we did live in a country where most non-Kurdish people could easily say all Kurds are terrorists or Kurdish people. I mean, now it's a different story. So I think that those breaks have been important. Hikmet, you can give me cues. Am I making sense? I feel like I'm giving, okay. Is it easy to follow what I'm saying?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so I guess the question around secularism and religion is a very, very important one. And I do make it very clear in the book that even though I set out to complicate what happens under queer politics in Turkey, so many different and sometimes contradictory things happen. I also like inevitably showcase what happens under the signifier Islam. So I use the term Islam in the title, but not to reify it, not to homogenize it, but to critique the way in which AKP government tries to monopolize it and homogenize it, even though people are pushing back against that. And I think that those pushbacks are very important, and I think they're going to be really critical in moving forward towards a country that's habitable for religious and secular people alike. I hope this answers your question.
Thank you, Evren. So let's move on to our discussion about the ongoing protests that are happening at Boğaziçi University, also known as the Bosphorus University. It has a very nice campus along the Bosphorus. And
A
it's
really
one of the,
nice piece of real estate, we should also say that.
yeah, so it's a very valuable real estate property in Turkey. Some people speculate that that might be why there's a lot of government crackdown on that university in order to control not just how the university is governed, but also its real estate as well. So that's something to keep in mind. So since the beginning of this year, basically 2021, right? So it's been almost 3-4 months at this point. Students and faculty at Boğaziçi, the Bosphorus University, have been protesting the appointment of a new chancellor, of a new president. And these protests at the Boğaziçi campus have been met with heavy-handed police response. Also, they have led to the government crackdown on LGBT students. Evren, I think your book provides important insights to make sense of these kind of ongoing protests at Boğaziçi University, as well as the government's crackdown on LGBT activists. So I'll ask you some questions about these protests, and in your answers, I would appreciate it if you could explain how your book can help us understand what's going on today at Bosphorus University and Turkey at large in terms of anti-LGBT kind of stance that the government has kind of more outspokenly adopted these days. So first of all, let's talk about these protests. What is the reason for these protests? And why did the government target LGBT students particularly? What's happening?
I mean, this is also how much I was able to follow. I try to follow everything, but obviously from afar, there might be a limit. And I would really appreciate it if people in the audience want to jump in and fill in with details. So, what happened in the chronological order is, first of all, the president appointed president to the Boğaziçi University. We call it rector in Turkish, but there was the appointment of a rector. And I think it's important to give this context because there were already ongoing protests. So Melih Bulu was appointed as the president of Boğaziçi University, which is against the regime, I guess, of faculty governance that is central to Boğaziçi University, where presidents are not appointed, they're elected. So protests started around that, first and foremost. Faculty and students protesting the appointments, saying that it's anti-democratic, that we want to elect our own. And there were ongoing protests inside the campus and outside the campus. That was already being cracked down. As the protests were unfolding, there was and I have read sort of various accounts of this. I'm not 100% sure which one is the precise one, but I think the account that I've encountered at least multiple times said that as part of the protests, maybe it wasn't part of it, there was an exhibit on campus. And there was a piece in the exhibit that I think, Hikmet is now showing the image of the piece that depicts the Kaaba. And it was also a little bit talked about a little bit in the initial video that Hikmet was screening as people were coming into the Zoom room. So you see the Kaaba with the figure of Shah Meran, which is a pre-Islamic figure. So that somebody is actually saying yes, okay, the exhibit was part of the protest. Okay, that's what I thought. Thank you so much, Yaprak. So the image depicts the Kaaba with Shah Meran superimposed onto. It's like, I think it's a carpet, like hand woven carpet like image, and then there are various LGBTI plus flags on the four corners, as you're seeing. So this created a huge. Well, initially this was critiqued by I think it's like Islamic Research Group, a student group on Boğaziçi campus, and they tweeted about it. They tagged Süleyman Soylu, the minister, on the tweets. So I don't want to say that the protests of Melih Bulu completely were channeled to that, but the entire government attention all of a sudden focused on this kind of anti-religious, or thank you, we'll talk about this, allegedly anti-religious kind of act, or like disrespect of religion. The kind of things that are used in the statement are inciting one group into hatred and kin ve nefret, like no kin, hatred and something else. I'm gonna look at it, actually it's in my notes somewhere. So they're alleging that these kinds of works will incite one group into hatred and, is it disgust, something like that, towards another group. So it's like dushman, yeah, hatred and animosity, actually. Thank you. And I think that's very important. This is something that I'm thinking about, and hopefully I will write at least a short piece about that, because I think it sits really awkwardly with, again, Wendy Brown's argument of tolerance as governmentality. So we don't have the government here acting as the agent of tolerance and inviting people, citizens who are allegedly intolerant of each other into tolerance, but they're preempting lack of tolerance that's assumed to exist among people. And I know that I'm going a little bit like long, but ultimately this became a huge, reason for the government to first of all bust the LGBTI plus club and confiscate rainbow flags as weapons, almost. Like, this is also an interesting kind of turn where like rainbow flags were treated almost as weapons and treated as signs of ties to terrorist organizations. And the club was closed, students were detained, a number of students were detained in quite violent ways. And then students started protesting this. So the protests then, they didn't shift, but they were simultaneously protesting and continue to protest the appointment of this like anti-democratic appointment of this president to the university, and protesting the violence towards students. One important thing to note for especially our American guests in the talk is that in Turkey, police is not allowed on university campuses, unlike in the US. Like, US is now trying to have a moment of kicking police off campuses because they've been such integral parts of university campuses. Like, my institution, Yale, has its own private police. It's really awful. This is true for lots of private universities, but even some public, and police can walk into any campus however they want in the US. In Turkey, they need special permission or invitation from the president or a dean. So the moment the AKP appointed president became the president of the university, he opened the gates to all kinds of police action on campus, which is really, I think, important to emphasize. So then, protests have been ongoing, as Hikmet mentioned, and there are continuous arrests, charges, releases, house arrests. You can't leave the country, but okay, we want you, put you in jail. So there's a continuous kind of show of governmentality, almost like continuous show of like, we're in charge, we're in power, we can put you away whenever we want, and you can't critique the government. But I think what's interesting, and I'll say one more thing and then we can maybe see if you have more questions or if people have questions. One important thing to notice is that Boğaziçi students really did, I think, beautiful work to interrupt the government's narrative that said this is disrespecting religion and inciting one group of people towards hatred and animosity towards another group. There were a few videos that circulated, and that Boğaziçi students prepared, and one of which is really, I think, important in interrupting this, in which there are, in every shot, there are two Boğaziçi students on campus, one of whom says, I have found this piece of artwork offensive to my religious sensibilities, and the other one says, I haven't found it offensive. And they both say, and we want to talk about this amongst ourselves, without government, without the state, and without police. So, and there were, women with headscarves in the video who say, it hasn't offended my religious sensibilities. There are others. And so it's not really like mapped on to people's subjectivities in the ways the government would like to. And the most important message there is that there will be difference in the world, and we can handle it. we don't need a homogenization of difference, and we don't need a polarization of people into respectful, disrespectful, pious, secular, Muslim, LGBT, etc. So I think that, but of course the government is not caving.
Mhm. So to kind of rephrase what you said, the government is using this so-called art exhibition and this supposedly blasphemous or insulting image, saying that you are playing with the sensibilities and values of the public at large, which is presumed to be a conservative Muslim public, and saying that this is actually inciting hatred and animosity. Are you talking here about like animosity and hatred toward pious Muslims, or are you talking about the potential backlash from that group? Because like the Kaaba is a holy image, and therefore kind of depicting that image in this particular way insults sensibilities. And some people, some conservative groups or Islamists might basically see it as an insult, and that causes polarization. So it's kind of a weird kind of rationality there, right? Like in terms of how they position that. So they are kind of proposing that this leads to further polarization in the society or something like that. Am I understanding it right?
Yes, I guess I'll just specify one thing. I do think that the government is using, and I think that like the crackdown on LGBTI plus people and activists and the rainbow flag and everything else associated with it, the latest crackdown is, to me, a sign that, like, that there is nothing left, like desperate measures must mean desperate times. So I think the government sees this as an easy thing to gather around, because they do have, I think they don't have, sorry, so they ideologically they're trying to find something to wrap a cohesive kind of voter base around, and this seems like an easy bet, though I don't think it is. So what I want to say, that it's quite possible, and I know for a fact, that some people have found that artwork offensive. Not They're not necessarily, they don't share the vision of Islam that AKP seems to, like, promote, but it's possible that it could be offensive to some people, but that can be talked about, and there can be conversations about what's the place of art in provoking, or like, making people think of what's the boundaries between, freedom of speech and hate speech. Like, these are kinds of things that people, and these are liberal frameworks too. Ultimately, I think they're limited, but I'm not suggesting that there is no way that piece could have offended somebody legitimately. It could have, but the response has absolutely nothing to do with what people would like to do with it anyway. I mean, art has historically done provocative things, and sometimes there have been, very serious responses to art pieces, like sometimes violent, sometimes otherwise. But I think that I do agree with the part that the government is making use of this moment to shore its own power up.
Mhm. Thank you, Ran. There are a couple of comments and questions, so I want to go over them. Enis Demirer provides the corrective to this art event. So he says, or they say, it was organized by an independent student collective that was formed as part of the protest at Boğaziçi. The event was attributed to the LGBT plus club, student-led LGBT plus club, even though they had nothing to do with the organization of the exhibit and with the commissioning of this particular artwork. So this artwork was not necessarily related to LGBT activists or the LGBT plus student-led club, but the government used it as an excuse to attack that LGBT club. So thank you for that corrective, Enis. Mohammed Yusuf asks, would you consider the appointment of Bulu and the continued assault on academic freedom and shared governance as continuing the liberalization of higher education? Can we talk about liberalization of higher education in Turkey?
I mean, I guess yes and no. So let me, and also thank you, Enes, for I knew that the club didn't have anything to do with the organization of the exhibit, but it was the, like, ultimately the easy target. So thank you for adding that. I don't think the appointment of Bulu is necessarily neoliberalization of higher ed. I think there has been there has been neoliberalization of higher education. You know, when I went to college in Turkey, there were like 2 private universities. Now there are, I don't know, 5 million, I feel like. There's an increasing privatization of education. There's like less and less investment in public institutions. They don't have funding. They cannot very easily hold on to their faculty. Private institutions pay a lot more. If people stay in the public, it's because either they have individual wealth otherwise and they can afford it, and or for the prestige of the university. So there has been a neoliberal transformation of education in Turkey for sure. I think that the appointment of Bulu is a more complicated topic, but this is something a bit hard to summarize, but some universities, and especially some public universities, have been strongholds in opposition to Erdogan. ODTÜ is another one, where at every graduation, students are holding banners critiquing the government as they sort of march on the green. So I think that this is more, you know, it's a few things. One, I really do think that there is something about having someone in power there who might help repurpose the very valuable piece of property. So if they move Boğaziçi University somewhere else in the city in a few years, I don't think that would be shocking to anyone. 2, they have immediately opened a law school and a business school at Boğaziçi University. I think that is a very fascinating, interesting move. Part of it is so that they can appoint more people who can endorse Bulu, but part of it is maybe also as a I don't know how privatized those schools will be because they're super new. They literally landed overnight. But I think that the way in which I talk about neoliberalism is that, you know, so things are privatized in Turkey. They have been privatized heavily and quickly under the AKP government. But the rhetoric is a national rhetoric. So, I mean, as they say, yerli ve milli in Turkish, local and national. That's the name of the game. But people are invited to protect and defend a nation or a national economy that's being continuously denationalized. There is a lot of, it's a little bit of a like crony neoliberalism as well, because a lot of the people who get these like projects of redevelopment or who, you know, get to build the new buildings or the highways, etc., are like construction companies very close to the government. So it is a messier thing. But I think that the piece about the land being so valuable and potentially up for grabs and now easier to grab for the government is one bit of it, and it might get privatized. But it's not just that. It's like that plus authoritarianism. It's like the fact that now the police can go into that campus any minute they want is also important. I hope this answers your question. It's a bit, I feel like my answer is a little bit rambling because this is such a new thing that, you know, you have to have an analysis of something, some distance needs to be there, some time has to pass. So I'm very happy to have this opportunity to think with all of you, but my answers might also not be the most satisfactory sometimes.
No, I think it's great, Evren. You are right. I mean, these things are happening as we speak, right? So maybe after we speak, something else will happen. So it's kind of hard to analyze these things on the go, but I think you are doing a great job. So I want to show you this image. Here's the Minister of the Interior. So he is one of those outspoken members of the Erdogan government. And he stated that in our past, there's no such thing in Turkish culture called LGBT+. So what does he mean by that? Is he saying something similar to what the Iranian president at the time, Ahmadinejad, mentioned when he said there is no gay people in Iranian culture? Are we seeing something like that? What is the purpose of such a statement, which again, in the previous AKP governments, there was no such denial saying that these people don't even exist. And then as a follow-up question to that, I think he tweeted something saying that, referring to that artwork, whoever did this in Boğaziçi University against our religious values are 4 LGBT perverts. Some people translate it as deviant, but I think pervert is a better translation here. LGBT sapkını. And Twitter actually flagged it, right, as hate speech, and it's removed from its platform. So let's talk about all these. What did he mean by there's no LGBT? Does he mean there are no gay people at all? There are no gender non-conforming individuals? What is his purpose here in making such a proclamation?
Thank you, Hikmet, for this question. I was actually doing an interview with, there's a really nice podcast series called, I think it's called Turkey Books Network. That this same question came up, and I think, I mean, I cannot say anything about his intent, you know, like it's impossible to know people's intent, but I can think about the effects this has, and the strategic changes in the government rhetoric are interesting. I write about the debates that took place in 2010 in the book, when Selma Aliye Kavaf, who was the minister of the name of that ministry changes all the time. I think it was called Women and the Family at the time, right? She said that homosexuality is an illness and it should be cured. And a lot of debates followed in its aftermath. So in one of the chapters of the book, I follow the events that lead to that moment and follow it. But Kavaf, for instance, very explicitly says in that moment, as a minister of the AKP government in 2010, I'm not saying that there are no homosexuals in Turkey. We know these cases exist, something like that. So there's an interesting shift to, you know, a recognition, even if they think it's a problematic, you know, case or whatever, to saying this is not authentic to Turkey. And I think that for me, the initial things that come to my mind are, one, this new emphasis. I mean, it's not brand new, but there's an increasing emphasis on the local and the national, and in kind of positioning AKP as the only protector, the only savior of the country against all these international threats, national threats. So positioning LGBTI plus people or activists or groups as not national and not local is going to kind of shore up this, as if there is something national and local, right? You have to make something the ideal other so that you can shore up, that you can create the vision or the image or the illusion that there is something national and local. I think that the national and local emphasis plays well to AKP's now dependency on the ultranationalist party MHP, which has been its coalition partner. Without them, AKP doesn't have the votes to stay in power, so they have to do some things to appease MHP. And I'm not saying that the attack on LGBTI plus people and politics is just because of that, but the emphasis on milli ve yerli is, I think, has a lot to do with that. So I think we're going to see, I think it's interesting to shift, you know, the rhetoric from, you know, it's an illness, it's a sin, but of course it exists, we know it, to it doesn't exist, it's not of Turkey, this is not authentically of Turkey. And I one thing that I've been seeing a little bit online as a response to this, which is, to me personally, it's worrisome. I don't want the government to set the agenda of queer people and politics, and I'm seeing a lot of emphasis on our existence. And I don't think we should go down that. Like, you know, so the government says you don't exist. Now what do? We say we exist, look at us, we are here, we were there, I mean, I think there's a lot of work to do. I'm not saying it's useless, but I really worry that the government's gonna drive the agenda to then, like, people trying to prove that we exist. And I think that's a bit pointless, because it's pointless to say that LGBTI plus people don't exist, or we don't have them, or historically they're not authentic to us.
Interesting point. And actually, I was thinking he specifically uses that term LGBT plus, right? There is no LGBT plus in our culture, which is a very specific terminology to refer to people coming from different sexual orientations and different gender identities, and people who are not gender non-conforming, right, being referred to with that specific LGBT plus term. So I thought maybe he is referring to there is no LGBT plus in the sense that the Europeans and Americans understand. And this kind of political activism is something that's supported by these Western powers. And those powers, as you said at the beginning of your talk, are interfering in our local politics. So by saying there are no LGBT plus people in our culture, what he means is all these so-called foreign power tactics to basically stir up and to create polarization in our culture is not going to work, because in our tradition, there's no such LGBT plus, by which I think he doesn't mean there are no gender nonconforming individuals or there are no people with different sexual orientations. Maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I thought it was something like that. What do you think? If he meant like that, how would you kind of analyze what he says? If he meant LGBT plus due to its association with activism?
Yeah, no, I think that's possible. And I think it again goes back to the government like insisting on framing certain things as foreign elements, right? So there couldn't be any like local authentic resistance to the AKP rule, because AKP rule like AKP equals authentic Turkey equals AKP. So they created that feedback loop. So then any resistance to the government and any critique of the government, I mean, some of those, of course, they don't even respond to, because I think it's a little bit more complicated to respond to the rhetoric of like a group like revolutionary Muslims, for instance. They don't respond to them directly, but they will, like the police will go break up those like breaking fast tables like yeryüzü sofraları. There will be crackdown, but there will not be rhetorical engagement. Whereas I think with LGBTI plus groups and movements and people, it's easier to say they are foreign elements anyway, right? Why are they resisting the government? Why are they not submitting? Why is there no biat? Because they're already foreign elements. So I think it does serve that argument and kind of, yeah, shores up AKP's polarization of like, right, anything that's truly Turkish, that truly looks out for this country, that's willing to give its life, that's willing to protect the economy and the borders and this and that, that can only align with AKP, cannot be critical of it.
Thank you, Evren. Yaprak, who's a PhD student at the University of California, San Diego, has a question. She says, there are some arguments about how AKP is using the LGBT plus frame to shift the focus from the unrightfulness of the appointment of this president as an direct appointee, a top-down appointee, to LGBT plus, and thus prevent the public from acknowledging the unrightfulness of the appointees in Kurdish cities. So what are your thoughts on this? Do you observe a connection between the anti-Kurdish policies and the oppression of LGBT plus in terms of AKP's neoliberal Islam?
This is a great question, Yaprak. Thank you so much. And it helps me make a connection I hadn't made before. So soon after the Gezi uprisings, maybe about like the following spring, I gave a talk at UC Berkeley. And during that time, so like we're talking about spring of 2014, 7 years ago. During that time, there was the Roboski incident had happened. You might have, maybe some of you might remember this. So there was a aerial bombing, and that killed a bunch of villagers in the Roboski Uludere district of Turkey. And there were a lot of uprisings, and then and in one of the, so during the protests, people were calling Uludere Roboski murder. Like there were banners that read Uludere Roboski's murder. And Erdogan said in one of his talks, these people keep complaining about Uludere, but the real murder is abortion. And he all of a sudden brought up abortion and also then that's extended to C-sections to, I'm going to make a connection, don't worry. So I know that it feels like I took the story somewhere else, but I really didn't. So then the debates were like, oh, is he just trying to change the agenda? What's he doing? Is this really, you know, is he just hijacking the actual political moment to make it about abortion, which has nothing to do with anything? Like, is it just, is there a real agenda, and is abortion the kind of cover-up agenda? And I, in that talk, also had argued that no, you know, like the sexual politics, reproductive politics, and morality politics have a lot to do with the, you know, biopolitics of Turkey that have a lot to do with the Kurdish region. And in fact, if I can find it, I will share this image with you guys, because I think it really speaks like beautifully to that moment. And then I will come back to the uprisings here. 1 second, give me 1 second. I hadn't thought about bringing this up, so I didn't really prepare it. I have lots of images from Gizli that you didn't get to see instead. Let's see. This, yeah, this is it. So let me make this kind of bigger. Okay.
Can you share your screen, EVREN?
Yeah, I'm going to now. I was just making sure. Oh, it says only host can share. Can you make me a host?
Yeah.
Or I can just send it to you, or I can put it in the chat. Either way.
Can you share it now?
Mm-mm.
Interesting. Yeah, you should be able to share it. I don't know what's happening.
Okay, now I can. Yeah, we tried this actually before. Yeah, okay. So this is the cover of Gırgır from the time. It says President Erdogan, well, but Prime Minister Erdogan, you are, you know, like all you say is Uludere, but every abortion is an Uludere. He actually said that. He didn't say abortion is murder. He said every abortion is an Uludere. And we see the kind of probably government aerial attacks outdoors, and this kid comes running indoors, and he says something like, "Daddy, daddy, the government is having an abortion again." And then the father says, "It's not abortion, it's the Kurdish opening." So I'm bringing this up because I think that I thought that at the time it was this really amazing commentary that really made a connection between being allegedly anti-abortion, right? I'm gonna stop sharing if that's okay. And being for life, right? Pro-life. I mean, there's similar things that go on in the US as well. And wanting life, right? Not wanting to end it while you are aborting Kurdish life elsewhere all the time. So I actually think that there are deep connections. So it would be the short answer is I would find it very unfortunate to say that LGBT, like the attacks on LGBTI club and other, like, you know, crackdowns on LGBTI plus events are a distraction from, you know, the appointees, the qayyums that have been appointed to Kurdish regions. I think these, like this government's biopolitical moves and kind of necropolitical moves are very, very connected. I think that their LGBTI plus politics are deeply connected to their Kurdish politics. I'm being a little bit quick with this answer just because I feel aware of time, but I don't know. And I'm curious what you think, Yaprak. I don't know if we can, I don't want to create more technical challenges for Hikmet, but
yeah, if anybody wants to speak up, by the way, please raise your hand, and I'm gonna try to give you permission to speak. I think I can do that. We'll try. But you can also type your questions in the Q&A section. Yeah, in relation to what you said in terms of how this kind of religiously inspired conservative discourses are very much part and parcel of the AKP government's neoliberal policies is very right on point. And I don't want to do like a shameless promotion, but in the Middle East review by MERIP, Middle East Research and Information Project, I published something about this topic very much along those lines. So those of you who are interested in that topic should read that, because it's a very common strategy, right? AKP always talks about these kind of, what is the term, like a heart button issues, or sensitive issues, and people think that it's actually part of their Islamic agenda, or it's part of their whatever, but actually they very much, as EVREN has mentioned, points to the marriage of Islam with neoliberalism, because there's definitely a close kind of overlap between those, which kind of, I think, partially answers Asla's question. She asks how all this relates to the biopolitics of the AKP regime. I can't find the question, I'm sorry, but she asks something
I think it's in the
about
chat, maybe not.
yeah, how the
I
reproductive
have
biopolitics.
raised her hand, but I don't know if we can find a way to let them speak. I will say in the meantime, Hikmet, maybe you can, when you have a minute, drop your piece into the chat so that people can find it more easily. But I wanted to say that, like, so if the larger project is about which lives are worth preserving and which lives aren't, right? Which bodies and which lives are, what's the word that I'm looking at? Like they're easily dismissible or killable and not even grievable. I think there is a general project. It's not really about like who gets the Qayyum. And in fact, I think that it's strange. AKP's polarizing project has two edges. In one way, they are polarizing the country into like two large groups. At the same time, they don't want the others to feel like they have anything in common. So then they want to divide it up to like, no, that's a Kurdish issue. No, that's an LGBTI plus issue. No, that's a, like just an environmentalist issue that has nothing to do with politics or neoliberalism. So they're trying to divide things up, but I don't think it's working. And I think that's one of the maybe beauties of this moment, that I don't think that the suggestion that LGBTI plus, like the attacks on the LGBTI plus club or students is just a way for the government to distract from the real issue that's Kurdish politics, because I think that they're all parts of like which lives will be saved and which lives will be discarded kind of projects.
An anonymous attendee has two questions on these recent points. The first one is in thinking about the risks of we are here, we are queer politics being reproduced in Turkey in response to government messaging. I'm wondering if the current uses of LGBTQ plus identities in Turkey to some extent already reproduce the identitarian, perhaps neoliberal tendencies of Western LGBTQ movements, and in what ways this may not be the case. Secondly, what are the possibilities and limits of coalition building across minority movements in Turkey, such as Kurdish Liberation Movement and queer politics?
Mm-hmm. These are great questions. Thank you. So I will say something about my coalition building first, then I will go back to your first question. I think that coalition building is always a tricky framework, one that I also do use, but I do think of it as a tricky, in the sense that coalition suggests that let's say the two groups or the three groups that will engage in a coalition already don't have anything in common. They don't have people in common. They don't have members in common. So as if various groups can exist homogeneusly and mutually exclusively from each other, which then can lead us to say, like, there's a Kurdish movement and then there's queer politics, as if there are no people who are fighting on both fronts. And there are many. In fact, as I was doing research, the very beginning of my research in 2008, 2009, many of the activists at like Lambda Istanbul would joke about like that, like most of Lambda Istanbul members or activists or volunteers, I guess, are Kurdish anyway, or there's a real majority. So they didn't think that this was not their issue, that there was a very committed anti-militarism besides anti-sexism, anti-homophobia, anti-transphobia, they were very invested in anti-capitalist, anti-militaristic kind of engagements in their politics. So I think that maybe part of what we need to do is to think about movements as always already coalitional within themselves, because they will never be perfectly homogenous. And there's a really great book, for those of you who are interested, I teach in so many of my classes, Grace Hong's Death Beyond Disavowal, that starts out with a talk Audre Lorde gave many years ago, in which she imagines Black politics always already coalitional, because she herself, as a Black feminist lesbian, right, is standing in those spaces as both someone who kind of both belongs and doesn't. So I think if we think of Kurdish liberation as already a coalitional project in and of itself, and queer liberation, queer movements as already coalitional within themselves, because they will have difference. Difference is a part of life. There's never going to be a super homogeneous, class-wise, ethnically, religiously, like gendered-wise project. So then I think that it's a little easier to think of coalitions always already happening. You know, like we just imagine they're not there sometimes. I hope this gets to your second question. And the first question, you know, I'm not sure what you have in mind with the risks of we are here, we are queer politics. I think, I mean, the question about identitarian neoliberal politics, I understand. And here's what I think about it. From what I have observed and I've been a part of, queer politics in Turkey really try their best not to lock into a particular identitarian form of politics. I do write about that, I think, the most explicitly in my chapter on trans sex workers, because I talk about them as people who have experienced the urban development projects of Turkey, because they do street-based sex work. Oftentimes they have experienced urban redevelopment as well as the changes in the police force, most close up. And I talk about their politics and their demand for a hate crime law as something that goes way beyond identity politics. So I think that I don't think that the LGBTI plus emphasis is going to go away. And I do think that, I understand, I'm not a huge fan of identity politics, but I do find the politics that's taking place in Turkey, and part of what I would have read from the book speaks to that too, that was unfolding under Gezi Park uprisings, is a politics that refuses to choose, you know, to use Nancy Fraser's, you know, framework to choose recognition over redistribution. They want recognition and redistribution. And a lot of really interesting neoliberal theorists of neoliberalism have said redistribution has always happened along what we refer as identitarian lines. It's been certain ethnic and racial minorities, certain gendered and sexual minorities that have gotten the short end of the stick in redistribution. But when we do stand up and demand for certain things, they make it look like identity politics that's cultural, that has nothing to do with redistribution. I'm kind of very quickly summarizing a lot of things, but I hope this helps. Like, I think that the LGBTI plus politics in Turkey is very exciting, to me at least, because it refuses to think without redistribution.
Thank you, everyone. So one of our audiences, Yaprak, wants to speak. She had some comments.
Great.
So Yaprak, you can take over. Unmute yourself, please. Thank you.
Okay, so can you hear me?
Yeah.
Awesome. I mean, so far we have diverged from that topic so much, but I just wanted to remind you about the things that happened in Boğaziçi University again in 2018. That wasn't so this current situation is not the first time that the police is raiding the university campus. And at the time, like 3 years ago now, I was a student at Boğaziçi and I was involved in the protests, and those protests were related to the literal national identity, the construction of the national identity of the Turkishness itself, because of the Turkey's invasion in Syria, because Boğaziçi students protested against Turkey's invasion in Syria. In short, I mean, there are many details about this. But then this became a point of reference for the government to create some sort of reaction in the public against the students at the same university. And many students stayed in the prison for several months, actually. So that's where my question was coming from. So the government always picks one topic, in my opinion and observation, the government always picks one topic that could elicit some sort of reaction in the community to make sure that it shifts focus from what is actually going on and at larger scale, which was in that case, many years, 3 years ago, was the military intervention and the looting and all kinds of violence the Turkish military was conflicting in the region. So I just wanted to remind the audience, if people know about this, and also the panelists about that. And then thank you so much for giving me the floor and also your answers.
Hikmet, did you want to add anything? I'll just say, like, thank you, Yaprak, for adding that story. I guess I wasn't, I do understand, and I think at the time it's very important to add this story because the government ends up deciding on who is with them and who is against them based on these kinds of events, obviously. But I do think that since one of the gestures, and I guess this is what I was trying to say, or this is where my concern was coming from, since one of the important modes of operation of neoliberalism is like individualizing everything and separating people and kind of have them be worried about their own bills and own jobs and own education and own health without really seeing what might be at stake to think together. I do think that it's important for, if there's a real attempt to say, let's focus on the LGBTI plus attacks only and forget everything else that's happening in the country, that's obviously awful. And I think that LGBTI plus club and activists should be the first people to say, no, there is more that we need to talk about. I don't think that, at least the activists that I know and that I'm in conversation with and that I'm following, are at all willing to forget the appointments of mayors in Kurdistan, in the Kurdish region, etc. So I think I do hear your concern, and if that were happening, I would be very concerned too. But I'm hoping that these things are being remembered and thought about and organized around together collectively.
Thank you, EVREN. So there's one more comment question that I want to raise, and we are already half an hour above our time limit. So maybe you can talk about it because it's kind of relates to the excerpt you were going to read from the Gezi Park protests. So our anonymous attendee says, you mentioned that the queer community in Turkey is multifaceted in terms of issues that they care about and talk about, such as environmental issues, women's rights, Kurdish rights, etc. Do you see that kind of solidarity coming from other activist groups towards the queer community? So queer community is involved in other forms of activism, but are there kind of cross-sectional solidarities among activist groups specifically supporting queer groups, especially in the wake of the newer developments, or have you observed more of a fractured single issue activist model? Basically, that kind of relates to the excerpt you were going to read about Gezi Park, right? So maybe you can summarize that a little bit in terms of
a little bit, or I wonder
that kind of solidarity happening at Gezi.
Yeah, I wonder if there's a section where I could just also just read by like that would summarize it, but maybe not. So one of the arguments, I'll just summarize it. One of the arguments that I make in the chapter where I talk about the Gezi Park uprisings is that I suggest that there was a shift in the mode of activism that was taking place, even though it was quite multifaceted, complicated, and not single issue. The mode of activism was something that I refer to as critique heavily when I was initially doing my research. And that, to me, was one of the reasons why a lot of people were not interested in LGBT activism or politics. They felt like they were being corrected all the time. They didn't have the right words. There were kind of class divides on who had the right terminology and language. And then I say what happens so I talk about two forms of left, for lack of a better term, engagement. One I call critique and one I call comments. And I suggest that what happened under during Gezi Park uprisings, in the Gezi Commons, müştereklikler is the word that's used in Turkish, is an extremely rich understanding of being one and not being the same, being together but being different, and being together in one's differences. And there were lots of people who had never been to a protest in their lives before. They did not think of themselves as political subjects. They were not interested in, I mean, everybody has to kind of follow what's going on in the news in general, but this was a moment of mobilization of lots of different people. So it's hard for me to say, some of them did have affiliations with feminist organizations or with maybe socialist organizations or with Kurdish organizations, but others had affiliations with soccer clubs or nothing. Some of them were from poor Alevi neighborhoods, but some of them were from posh Istanbul neighborhoods. So there was a coming together of bodies that was also a deeply instructive moment about standing together in the face of and with difference. So in that spirit, I guess I try to be careful with terms such as coalition or solidarity. Not that I do use them too, not that I don't use them, but I try to do it so that I don't suggest an initial separateness that then brings people together. Now with Gezi, there truly were separate groups that were brought together physically in a way that wouldn't have happened otherwise, probably people who would not have crossed paths otherwise. And I talk about the importance of the physical coexistence and the physical resistance of bodies together that was very kind of what people refer to as dreamlike and surreal in a way, but also extremely exciting. One of the very famous examples that comes up in that I bring up, that comes up in a documentary I talk about in the chapter that many people will recite, is that you have soccer fans and sex workers resisting the police side by side. So when soccer fans call the police sons of whores, which is a very generic curse word in Turkish, the sex workers turn to them and say, we are whores and we are not with the police. So you have to watch what you're saying and you have to watch how you're cursing. And then there are these non-sexist and non-homophobic and transphobic and kind of whorephobic or sexualphobic cursing workshops done with people and by people. So I feel like these kinds of transformations are important, but at the same time, there were also lots of people who did not identify politically one way or another. I find that the most exciting thing, right? Like the mobilization of the previously apolitical subject and what they care about and what it means to them to be together, to be doing something together with others, or to be resisting with others. I think that the single issue fractured activist model is not as prevalent in general in Turkey as it is in other places, though there are some recent, I think it would be unfair to not mention that, there are some recent really unfortunate sort of transphobic, trans-exclusionary strands of feminism that are rearing their head, that are being a lot more sort of exclusionary and single issue, I guess, because they even want to define what womanhood is for feminism. But overall, I think it's a more complicated terrain, and I really hope it remains that way.
On that note, I want to say one final thing. I'm gonna let everybody go. I'm sure you're exhausted. Thank you, EVREN, for staying so long. But one final thing in relation to what you just said, in terms of like fractured and issue-oriented politics. There is a trans activist who's also a known kind of figure, Jilet Sabahat, which would be, how would you translate it? Razor Blade Sabahat. That's their stage name. So on Instagram, there was an interview with Jilet Sabahat, and she said that there's so much government crackdown on LGBT individuals, and especially in relation to women's rights. As you know, Turkey has removed itself officially from the Istanbul Convention, which is aimed at, it's a general European Union or European Commission initiated treaty that Turkey actually was one of the major signatories, and it happened in Istanbul, right? So Turkey now removed itself from that treaty. So Gillette Sabat was saying, no matter what they do, they cannot crack down on us. Why? Because women's issues and gender-based, gender rights groups are not organized activist groups like, let's say, some Kurdish group that has a Kurdish political party, right? There's no like women's party, or there's no like LGBT party, or not one single organization that you can easily crack down, put them in jail, dismantle. What do you think of that statement? Because there's no like leader, there's no organized activism around gender issues, it is more difficult for the government to have a total crackdown. No matter how much they crack down, these kind of activism will still survive and thrive. Do you agree with that?
I do and I don't. I mean, I don't think that like the Kurdish movement is dying because a lot of its previous leaders are sadly sitting in jail. So I don't think any movement is captured by a political party. If it's a real movement, I don't. So in that sense, I don't agree. But I do agree that non-centralized organizing is harder to capture. Like organizing that's more in the capillary and that's in the more kind of artilleries of the social body is harder to crack down. So they don't know leaders. They arrest whoever they find. And I think that's kind of important in that sense to have leaderless organizing in some ways. But I also understand why people want to organize as political parties, like under HDP, for instance. The other thing that I will say is, and maybe that's a nice note to end on. So when the first, not the 2015 march, because that was the first time the Trans Pride March happened in 2015, and the LGBTI plus Pride March a week later was attacked. So that was a bit unexpected. But the next year, when the governor's office declared that they were not going to allow the march and the organizing committee was worried about the violence, they basically announced that they made this, I think this was 2016, they said we're dispersing. We're just going to go into the city and we're going to have a march everywhere in the city, every corner. We're not going to gather in Taksim, but we're just going to be everywhere. And people were going into shops and street corners and other places. And they were like, they basically turned the entire city into a march. People were also filming themselves, reading the statement, the press release that would be read normally in various parts of the city. And I thought that was actually a very meaningful resistance, because there was no way the police could run all over the town and crack down on everybody. There is something to be said about bodies being together in one place. I don't want to give up on that dream, and I don't think anybody has given up on someday being able to march together. That's still very meaningful. But I think that there is, I do agree to the part about Gillette Sabahat's statement that it's a little bit harder to crack down when there's no obvious leaders to arrest, perhaps.
On that note, I think it's time to let you go. We made you tired. It's a long talk. Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. We really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for everyone who came and stayed for now over an hour and a half. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Take care. I'm gonna
Bye.
let you go. Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.